Now, this all sounds all very fine, and as I've already said before, these international stipulations have had some impact on the operation of the market. So to some extent, the further reduction of equity ratios has been stopped. But this needs to be qualified now by taking a closer look at these stipulations. Now, what we need to know about Basel I and Basel II is that the 8% rule does not equally apply to all assets. It fully applies only to credits given to private parties. So if a bank gives a credit to your company or to you as a person, then it needs to keep an 8% equity reserve as a safeguard against the risks associated with this investment. On the other hand, if a bank grants a credit to its federal government, the reserve ratio is 0. Okay? 0. If it grants a credit to another OECD central government, the reserve ratio is 0. If it grants a credit to a federal agency or similar things, then the reserve ratio is typically 20% of 8%, so less than 2%, okay, 1.2%. So you see what this means. Now relate this again to what I told you before about the strong presence of governments on financial markets, especially on the bond markets. Well, it means that for the largest chunk of the capital invested in the financial markets, no reserve needs to be held at all. Now, why this exception? Well, of course, that's not difficult to understand, right? The regulator has, of course, taken notice of his own interest. The government who have created these regulations, well, they have made the regulation hit only private parties, but not themselves. Now, as a consequence, therefore, the leverage ratio was not significantly reduced, but it merely created a strong incentive for banks to reduce capital invested in private firms and to increase their holdings of government bonds. Thereby, they could further reduce the leverage ratio. The second consequence, so we had not a solution to the fragility of the financial markets, but the financial markets have been as fragile as before and have become even more fragile since 1988, when we had the Basel I agreement. The second consequence, and perverse consequence of these agreements, could be observed in this spring of 2008, because this regulation actually amplified the credit crunch that we experience on the financial markets. Let's think again put ourselves into the position of a banker who has given, let's say, a credit of $1 million to, let's say, to private parties, and needs to hold an equity ratio of 8%. So he holds $80,000 capital to back this up. Now let's say something goes wrong with this investment. And so he needs to adjust the book value on his balance sheet, and it will reduce it, let's say, from 1 million to 800,000. Then he would be, I need less than this, because this he wouldn't survive. It were from 1 million to 800,000. He has only 80,000 of capital on his hand. He would be bankrupt. So let's take a smaller figure, from 1 million to 950,000. Okay, so he loses $50,000, and this $50,000 eats up not his liability, but of course his equity. So his equity is reduced from 80,000 to 30,000. But then, of course, these 30,000 are no longer 8% of 950,000. So what can he do? Well, one solution is to find new partners who will pour additional capital into his company. And if he cannot find them, he must reduce his investments. He must reduce his engagements. So he will reduce the credits that he has granted, before it was 950,000, to a sum that corresponds, that makes 30,000 being 8% of this sum. So something like, $400,000. So he needs to drastically reduce the amount of credit in the economy. So you see, we see in this example, and that's actually what has happened, and was one of the reasons why the Fed was induced to take this unusual step of simply swapping assets, bad assets on the bank balance sheets against treasury bonds. And it was because of this regulation that the credit crunch was stronger, much stronger than it would have been in a free market economy. In a free market economy, the company would not have taken the immediate step of reducing its other investments. Okay, so let me then conclude. My conclusion can be in 4 points. First, regulation, financial markets regulation, and we might pretty much generalize here and say all financial market regulation covered by our definition does not attack the root cause of our present crisis and of the financial crisis that we had in the past 35 years. One of the reasons why it does not attack the root cause is because it's not in the self-interest of governments to give up central banking and to give up leverage within the financial industries, because government stands to profit most from precisely these two institutions that make the financial industries fragile. Third, financial regulation increases costs and therefore reduces the efficiency of capital allocation. And fourth, financial regulation creates new problems on its own, problems that would not exist even if we just had a lender of resort but no financial regulation, and thereby risks amplifying the crisis resulting from our present monetary system. Thank you for your attention.